tensions in the Middle East have escalated dramatically as Israeli forces launched a series of intense airstrikes targeting locations in Tehran and Lebanon. These actions were met with immediate retaliation from Iran, which reportedly fired new Khorramshahr 4 missiles towards Israel, further intensifying an already volatile situation. Now, the United States has warned of a potential increase in attacks, even as the House of Representatives narrowly rejected a resolution aimed at curbing military actions against Iran. Now, amidst this escalating conflict, a critical humanitarian effort is underway to evacuate South African citizens stranded in the region. The Department of International Relations and Cooperation, DIRCO, has urged over 6,400 registered South Africans to utilize limited available flights for their safety, anticipating heavy attacks in the coming days. While the South African government actively works on evacuation plans, a KwaZulu-Natal-based travel agency has already successfully brought at least 150 citizens back home. Iran has also expressed its readiness to assist in these evacuation efforts, highlighting the urgent need for international cooperation to ensure the safe passage of civilians caught in the crossfire. For more on this, let's welcome our guest. I'm joined by independent political and foreign affairs analyst Amir Bego-Rioromi, as well as Zahir Lahar, who is the Chief Director of United Nations Politics, Peace and Security Department of International Relations, as well as our very own SABC News correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Peace, joining us live from New York. A very good afternoon to you. Amir, perhaps let me start with you on this particular matter. You know, how does the escalating Iran-Israel conflict, particularly with the reported deaths, of course, now of Iran's supreme leader and now the U.S. House's stance on war powers, reshape perhaps global power dynamics and, of course, those existing international alliances, including those involving major non-Western powers?
Yeah, good afternoon to you and all your viewers. You know, I think the first thing to recognize is that this is no longer just a regional war. When Iran, Israel, and United States are all directly involved, it inevitably starts affecting global politics. What is also, you know, what this also exposes is how fragile the current international system really is. Many countries, especially in the global south, already feel that the international law is applied selectively, and situations like this reinforces that perception. So at the same time, we have powers like China and Russia and the rest of the BRICS bloc, really, who are watching this really closely. And conflicts like this often accelerate the shift towards a more fragmented, multipolar world where countries start hedging or balancing, rather, their alliances rather than firmly choosing one particular side. We are seeing this with Saudi, we are seeing this with India and many other countries in the region as well. And unfortunately, you know, what all of this does is that, you know, it will impact humanitarian impact on ordinary people. And because of the geopolitical crisis, these human impacts often gets pushed into the background, and the political needs take center stage and get prioritized by respective governments.
Yeah, and let me bring in then, you know, DIRCO in this conversation. So here, of course, we now seeing civilians being caught in the crossfire, as do these, you know, escalations always involve. Given the conflict and the urgency for now over 6,400 registered South Africans to evacuate, give us a sense and perhaps talk to the specific logistical challenges that DIRCO is currently encountering.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to address you. Look, the situation, of course, is fraught with uncertainty. We're in a situation where we cannot predict then the extent of this conflict and how long it will continue. I could speak about our approach with regard to the conflict, but with regard to your specific question, regarding the South Africans. Of course, as we had indicated, there are just over 6,400 South African citizens that have registered their presence on the Travel Smart system that we have. We urge all other South Africans to register their details on the Travel Smart system, so we are aware of who is affected. And from our side, we have, as DIRCO, encouraged those in the region that are there for non-essential travel, who wish to evacuate. They need to use the official channels. Of course, one, they need to contact the embassies concerned within the particular regions that they're in, but they have to work within the constraints of the environment they're in. So the countries that they're in will have specific regulations in the manner in which they can be allowed to leave, and the evacuations and the number of flights, etc. So the challenge, of course, is that the airspace is open and closed at sporadic times, and we are at the hands of the airlines and the regulations of the various countries. So these individuals and the South African citizens that are affected need to monitor the situation, be in touch with the airlines, the travel agents, and take the opportunity when the airspace is open for a period of time, use that opportunity to leave. Of course, the airlines have resumed limited commercial flights, so it is a bit of a challenge. We also have encouraged or discouraged, I should say, South Africans from all non-essential travel to the region at this time because of the nature of what is going on.
Yeah. And of course, when we're monitoring all angles, including what's happening on the ground with a number of our correspondents, I want us to then get into, the recent escalation and the U.S. House of Representatives decision regarding war powers. What is the U.S. government's current strategy now for de-escalating the Iran-Israel conflict or U.S. Israel-Iran conflict? And what are, its defined red lines, as I would put it, that if crossed would trigger then a more direct U.S. intervention?
Well, I think the U.S. intervention is quite direct already, Unathi, and you are not seeing a pullback here from the United States, particularly the rhetoric you're hearing from President Trump and his Secretary of Defense, who goes by, the renamed Secretary of War title these days, Pete Hegseth. If you look at President Trump's latest social media post, he talks about there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. After that, and the selection of a great and acceptable leader, which he has also said he wants to be part of that decision-making about who will govern Iran moving forward. We and many of our wonderful and very brave allies and partners will work tirelessly to bring Iran back from the brink of destruction, a destruction that essentially is being wrought by the United States and Israel. Now, use that as a counterpoint to what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is saying, right? He put out a statement yesterday calling for the unlawful attacks in the Middle East and beyond. They're causing tremendous suffering and harm to civilians throughout the region. This is Antonio Guterres, and it poses a grave risk to the global economy, Unathi, particularly the most vulnerable people. The situation could spiral beyond anyone's control. It's time to stop the fighting and get serious diplomatic negotiations going. The stakes could not be higher, said the Secretary General. And if you look at the numbers, right, this is a numbers game. How much is this war costing? We are seeing estimates out of think tanks in Washington, D.C., speaking to the cost of this on a daily basis being up to $1 billion a day. If you look at the price of jet fuel in just the last week, 58% up. If you look at the price of crude oil in just the last 7 days since this war began, up 38%. So never mind the fact that airspace is closed. The fact is you're going to be paying more for those tickets, right, given the higher demand. And to Zair's point, the difficulty in terms of repatriating people under these very trying conditions, just ask the United States how difficult it has been for them to choreograph the exit of Americans stuck in the Middle East because they were not forewarned that this escalation was going to happen. And so you're seeing the State Department scramble right now to get charter flights, the logistics around those charter flights, online forms that Americans have to fill in. They've got 24/7 manned telephone lines. Given the urgency of this moment, and even so, it is still difficult for the US to repatriate their own citizens. So this is a complicated time, and what the UN wants to see moving forward is that there is a standing down of troops and that this war ends. I'll give you the latest from Masoud Pezeshkian, the Iranian president. He's just put out a statement in which he's apologized to the Gulf states, Unati, for the retaliatory strikes that have targeted U.S. interests based in those Gulf countries. He has said that they will no longer attack these Gulf countries moving forward unless attacks against Iran emanate from them. So we are in a fluid situation. There's the economic toll, there is the civilian toll that keeps rising, and of course calls from the international community led by the SG that the forces stand down and get back to serious diplomatic negotiations, which I might add were ongoing before this escalation in the Middle East.
Yeah, Zahir, I want to go back to you. You mentioned, of course, that South Africa also has a position in as far as what we are currently seeing, in Iran, as well as how it's affecting other Gulf countries, as of course you've heard also Sherwin talk about just some of the dynamics here. We spoke, of course, in the context of, the South African government's efforts to evacuate its citizens from these war zones or conflict zones. How is DIRCO then coordinating with other partners? I think this is also quite important, including countries like Iran, which has offered assistance, and international organizations to streamline, the evacuation process and, of course, provide those consular support. I just want you to expand a little bit on those coordinated then, responsibilities from countries to countries, particularly when we look at the sensitivities around international humanitarian law and, of course, responsibilities here.
Thank you. Well, of course, we've got to work within the parameters of the jurisdictions where the South Africans are basically stuck. And there are different ways in which different countries are dealing with evacuations, with the opening of airspace, etc. And as Sherwin indicated, this is not something that only South Africa has to deal with. There are thousands and thousands of travelers stuck in all these states that are affected. So we've got to work within those parameters, working with the countries concerned. And of course, that necessitates us engaging with those governments, with the embassies of all those states, the Gulf states, Iran, to ensure that South Africans are basically able to leave if they choose to leave. Of course, many South Africans that are there are also expats. And these are ones that are living in the region, and they've of course got to follow the guidance of the countries where they are based. And should they wish to return back to South Africa, of course, that has to be facilitated through the mechanisms that are in place in terms of the flights that are able to leave.
Yeah, I just want to bring you.
But of course, ultimately, the situation. Yeah.
No, continue, Zahir.
Yeah. No, I thought I should say that ultimately the challenge is the fact that we have this conflict in the first place. The fact that we have a conflict that should not have happened should the parties have pursued the diplomatic option of engagement, of trust, of working together to amicably resolve the issues that brought them apart. We have this dire humanitarian situation, these consistent breaches of human rights, this massive conflict that is affecting all of us because of the failure of diplomacy and the failure of political will to engage to resolve the conflict.
Absolutely. Amir, let me bring you back in. I mean, just recently, of course, we saw in that press briefing at the Pentagon, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying that the U.S. and Israel will soon have complete control of Iranian airspace and that operations will last as long as necessary. I mean, he said many other things. In strategic terms, what does this complete control actually mean? Some have indicated, of course, regime deterrence, or are we looking at something closer to coercive dominance. Your take?
Yeah, I think the US hasn't really clearly communicated its objective, and it keeps on changing as they go by. It started with eliminating Iran's nuclear power, to then regime change, to then bringing liberty for the Iranian people. So there's just lack of consistency from the Israeli and the US side of things. So I don't necessarily understand the deeper objective, other than what exactly you mentioned earlier, which is, to make sure that the Western hegemony keeps strengthening itself, particularly in a region that is closer to the other, world superpowers, being China and Russia at this given stage, But at the core of it, what we really must understand is that, the Middle East is already very fragile security environment to begin with. So escalations of this nature really, risk making things more unstable. And if the Persian Gulf states really, get directly involved or targeted, that could really affect, just the regional and political, but also the global energy markets as well. And it's not going to stay within that region alone, but it's going to have long-term implications globally, specifically with the way in which Iran has moved strategically within its war strategy so far. So closing the Strait of Hormuz and making sure that the energy infrastructure of the other Persian Gulf countries, like UAE and Qatar, are also negatively affected, shows that Iran's strategy is to involve the rest of the region and the world into this war, to make sure that it can also practice its power in different forms. And in this case, it will be economic.
All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. Unfortunately, that's all we have. Really do appreciate your analysis and, of course, your time on the program. Amir Zahir, as well as Sherwin, and, of course, Amir Bagarioroma is the political analyst and foreign affairs analyst, as well as Zahir Lahar, Chief Director, United Nations Political Peace and Security at DIRCO, and our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce.